guys, welcome to Priceless B Movies. I'm your host, Colin Price, and I would like to take you back in time about 25 years, down to the summer of 1999. For those of us who are old enough to remember that, we understand that that was a pretty big summer for movies. They weren't all classics, but there was definitely this oversaturation of movies in that summer. We got Star Trek, Star Wars: The Phantom Menace. We got The Sixth Sense. We got Wild Wild West. We had The First American Pie. And then in between all of those, there were some movies that kind of slipped through the cracks, didn't get a whole lot of fanfare. Kind of like this one, Mystery Men. Mystery Men is a superhero comedy starring Ben Stiller, William H. Macy, Hank Azaria, Paul Reubens, Janeane Garofalo, Kel Mitchell, Tom Waits, Greg Kinnear, Jeffrey Rush. I know I'm missing some people here, but I'm going to run out of breath real soon. It is High Times in Champion City, which is what it basically is kind of like a mixture between Tim Burton's Gotham City and the city in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. Crime is at an all-time low thanks to their great superhero Captain Amazing, played by Greg Kinnear. In fact, things are going so well that he's starting to lose endorsements. See, this guy isn't really about helping people so much as he's about keeping his name in the headlines and getting money from his sponsors. They really treat his nature as a superhero is kind of like you would treat a NASCAR driver. It's a lot of where some of the satire in this movie comes from. But since Captain Amazing is either killed or incarcerated just about all of his primary enemies, he decides he's going to do the only thing he can do. He's going to use his pull with the city to facilitate the release of one of his greatest enemies, Casanova Frankenstein, played by Jeffrey Rush. Unfortunately, Captain Amazing isn't all that upstairs, and he gravely underestimates Casanova Frankenstein and ends up being captured. So now that Champion City's greatest hero is MIA, who's going to come and fight the bad guy? Who's going to come and save the day? I'll tell you who. A ragtag gang of misfits who have really quirky abilities and powers and who are going to have to learn to work together in order to do what is right. This group includes Ben Stiller as Mr. Furious, a man who derives his power, if you'll call it that, from his uncontrollable rage and frustrations and insecurities. Also, we have William H. Macy as the shoveler. As they say in the film, he shovels well. He shovels very well. Then we have Hank Azaria as the Blue Raja. I couldn't begin to tell you what this guy's deal is. He throws forks at people, okay? Then we have Janeane Garofalo as the bowler, who carries the skull of her deceased father into a possessed bowling ball that she uses to attack people with. Kel Mitchell as the invisible boy, who can only be invisible if no one is looking at him. Yeah, I know I didn't write it. And Paul Reubens as the spleen, whose noxious knockout gas is exactly that. This is a fun movie from 1999, especially from that summer, though. Like I said, in a summer that was really oversaturated with big hit movies. Like every week, there were at least 2 movies coming out that were expected to be box office juggernauts at the time. You have to remember, and I like to, tell my nieces and nephews this from time to time, but back in 1999, we didn't have YouTube. We weren't bombarded with trailers and memes and spoilers, the day that something came out. I remember a time when you actually had to call the theater and they had a list of the movies, what was showing, and and a list of what trailers would be playing before each movie. There were people who would go to the theater, buy a ticket for a movie just to watch the trailers, and then they would go home because they'd already seen the movie however many times. That was kind of the reality that we were in when this movie came out. Not to tell some walking uphill in the snow for 15 miles story, but I do want to stress that this movie was kind of ahead of its time. Comic book movies weren't really a thing. Outside of Batman and Superman, if you really think about it, the 90s were full of kind of one-offs. You had The Rocketeer, The Shadow, The Phantom, Spawn. We did just have the first Blade, but that was like a year before this came out. So comic book movies were just kind of starting to gain notoriety. They were kind of seen as more like a novelty than a mainstay of cinema. And because of that, I do think this movie is far more relevant today than it was back then. I think back in the 90s, if I remember correctly, a lot of the reviews for this were kind of lukewarm. A lot of people were saying it's meh, it's okay. But hey, what do I think of it? That's what's important, right? That's why we're watching this. I think it's funny. It definitely has its moments. I do think that it works better when it is poking fun at the superhero genre and kind of the the stereotypes, the archetypes of who these characters are, the origins of certain characters. I do think that my favorite scenes of the movie are basically any time that Greg Kinnear and Jeffrey Rush are on screen together. When they're going at it, as like lifelong enemies and trying to outsmart and outwit each other. And you have the evil character who is actually highly intelligent, and then you have Greg Kinnear who's just kind of posturing the whole time. It's kind of flipping that on its head. Usually the hero is going to outsmart the villain, and here the best scene of the movie arguably is when Jeffrey Rush gets the one up on him. It is so well written and so funny. The cast overall is pretty good, except for one who I will bring up in my cons toward the end of the video. But particularly William H. Macy, Hank Azaria, Greg Kinnear, and Jeffrey Rush are the four who seem to be having the most fun. Jeffrey Rush, I swear that he was doing this and kind of trying out some things that he would bring to his performance a couple years later in Pirates of the Caribbean. I mean, seriously, just let's do a brief side-by-side here, okay? Evil Laugh-In Mystery Men versus Evil Laugh-In Pirates of the Caribbean. Rush is always fun as the villain in just about anything, but where I do think this movie falls apart is that tonally it's kind of all over the place. It can't really find that balance of comedy, and I do think one of the issues was that a lot of the actors, especially Janeane Garofalo and Paul Reubens, I think that they were allowed to improv just a little too much. After a while, it does kind of look like a group of comedians in costumes bantering with each other and not these people who are supposed to be getting together and saving the day. There are some moments that are particularly distracting for me in that regard. Also, and I know I'm going to get some heat for this, Ben Stiller. He's definitely a love him or hate him kind of guy. And unfortunately, I'm on the raw end of that spectrum. I can't stand Ben Stiller. I can't think right now of a single scene in any movie I've ever seen Ben Stiller in where I thought he was funny. He is just cringy in everything he says and does. He's just one of those actors that really rubs me the wrong way. I don't get what people think is funny about him. And unfortunately, he's kind of front and center in this group. And so you spend a lot of the movie with him. And when he's doing these little quirks, like anger taking over, I'm like, I can't. It's so cringy. It's so dumb. I just can't stand the guy. Now that I've got that rant out of the way, at least Meet the Parents was kind of funny because of Robert De Niro. I do think that this is a fun popcorn flick, regardless of my Ben Stiller rant, though. And I definitely think that it deserves another look, especially nowadays. We're kind of in the heyday of comic book movies. There's a different comic book movie coming out like every month. I do think that this deserves another look, and especially if you're part of this younger generation and you've never even seen this, definitely check it out. Mystery Men gets 3 stars. There's fun to be had here, even if I'm not crazy about who they cast as the main hero. I still think that there's enough in here to justify viewing. Or if you are like my age and the last time you saw this movie was when it came out 25 years ago, check it out again. You might have a different perspective on it than you did a quarter century ago. That's my review of Mystery Men. Stay tuned, I got a lot more coming. Thanks for watching Priceless B Movies.